This is Bryan with ScreenFiles.com in review. And what I'm looking at today is 2008's The Strangers, directed by Bryan Bertino. And this is a movie I've seen before, though recently I learned that Rennie Harlin, who is a director I think is awesome, he's really interesting. Not everything he does hits, but it tends to be interesting regardless. Is directing a trilogy based upon Bryan Bertino's movie. So I thought it would be a good time to revisit The Strangers. And when I first saw it, I didn't like it, because I thought that the protagonists were too ghostly, almost supernatural in fact. And that really bothered me because The Strangers claim to be based upon real life happenings. Though I should say it typically bothers me when people put based on a true story in front of their movies, because I know going in that 9 out of 10 movies won't do that justice. And The Strangers doesn't, which kind of just irks me. It's just one of my pet peeves. In any case, The Strangers was supposedly based upon the Tate Bianca murders that happened in 1969, and 5 people were killed. This was done by Charles Manson and his family. And also the Kitty murders, which happened in 1981 in Kitty, California at the Kitty Resort. In this instance, 4 people were killed, though unlike with the Tate LaBianca murders, none of the killers were found that I'm aware of. So this is real fertile material to adapt. And as I said, at the time, I don't think Bryan Bertino did that particularly well. Which isn't to say that The Strangers is a bad movie by my reckoning. It just needed to treat the material more honestly, as opposed to making virtually a ghost movie, which it should not have even resembled. Though, as I said, I recently rewatched it. Though the problems I noted when I first saw it are still there. The protagonists still seem almost like ghosts in the way they move about, in the way they appear in one place to the next. Still irritating, that hasn't changed. Though I did notice something the second watch that I didn't the first, something that I really liked. Namely that you never see the faces of the killers, even when they're unmasked. What would happen is that the scene would be shot from an angle where you either couldn't see their faces or they were so far away that you couldn't quite make out their faces. All you knew that there were 2 white women and a white man. Beyond that, and their hair color, things like that, but you still couldn't see the faces. And I thought this was really an effective way to tell the story, because it said to me that the killers were always hiding in plain sight. You didn't need to see their faces, because they're everyman. They look like any white person. So it made the movie scarier for not showing their faces at the end. And I think that was one of the best decisions Bryan Bertino made. Though, as I said, there are too many other decisions that were made leading up to it that didn't quite work so well. The movie revolves around a couple, James Hoyt and Kirsten McKay, played by Scott Speedman and Liv Tyler. And they're just visiting his house, and the killers just go after them because they're there. There's literally no other reason for what happens to this couple. And that's pretty interesting. Though Bryan Bertino seemed to do things to further the plot, as opposed to things that real people actually did. And that began to frustrate. And it happened in ways both small and huge. For instance, Glenn Howerton plays Mike, who is James Hoyt's best friend. he visits their home after the strangers had attacked. He sees that the door has a huge hole in it, and the house is just wrecked. Yet it never occurs to him to once call out to see where James is, where Kirsten is. Never occurs to him, except to serve the plot, as opposed to a human response, which is to say, the minute you enter that house, you would probably go, James, Kirsten, where are you? Something to indicate that you're entering it. But, as I said, that doesn't happen. And it frustrates me because it could have been done. The movie would have proceeded just as it did without it, but it would have been tenser. It would have been just a little bit scarier. Though I think Bryan Bertino didn't do that because he had something in mind to happen to Mike. And that could only happen if Mike didn't make a sound until a particular moment. And it was kind of cheap. And it was kind of pointless. And didn't need to happen in that fashion. It could have worked in a more organic way. So that frustrated me. And another thing is that, as I said before, the strangers appeared almost like spectral entities as opposed to actual people. That's why I should mention I prefer the sequel to this movie, which is The Strangers Pray at Night, because I do think Bryan Bertino's movie looks better, but Johannes Roberts' sequel grounds the killers. They become people. And I appreciated that because that's what they were in the first place. Insane? Sure, but also just human. Though, as I was saying, there's a scene where James Hoyt, Scott Speedman, is trying to see if his car was started. Prior, the car had been vandalized by the strangers, so it's pretty much a mess, but he tries in any case. And one of the killers reaches in through a broken window and touches him on the shoulder. He turns around and she vanished. This, once again, irritates me to no end. This is not fucking Doctor Strange. Those people aren't magicians, or this is not a supernatural story. And so, the idea that this happens a lot in this movie just frustrates me. I think I recall one instance where you have one of the killers running by something in the distance. They needed more of that. Though, as I said, I find The Strangers fairly frustrating to watch. And the way Bryan Bertino treats his antagonist makes it even more less interesting. It's a very slow burn. Oh yes, I forgot to mention. There's a record player in the home of James Hoyt, and it starts to play at odd moments. Leave the room and a record player will be playing. This is, once again, frustrating. It's a little thing. And I suspect that Bryan Bertino did it to build up suspense and to keep the audience on uneven footing. But for me, it didn't do that at all, and it just frustrated me because there's a little arm on the side of the turntable that holds the needle. You lift up the arm from a cradle and you place it on the record. That's how record players work. They don't accidentally start playing. They literally cannot do that. Short of someone literally sneaking in, putting on a record, and hiding. Which sounds really stupid, by the way. Though, I would have respected that more than what Bryan Bertino ultimately did. If I recall, it happens at least 3 to 4 times. Each time it happens, beyond the first time, like I said, it doesn't make the movie any scarier. It just adds to the frustration because I'm not understanding how it is that these people can do what they do. And another thing that irritated me is that the killers seemed to know the house really well. This was the house of James Hoyt, once again, Scott Speedman. And while the movie indicates he didn't spend a lot of time in it, he had to know it better than someone who had never entered it. The strangers had never been in this house before, yet somehow they seemed to move very comfortably, invisibly around it. This is just ridiculous to me. And I should mention, not only can they move around it as if they aren't there at all, and soundlessly, they seem to have not noticed that there's a shotgun and shotgun shells in the house. You can't have it both ways. Either the killers have been in the house before and know it well. You have to establish that, though. You can't just assume that people will know that that's the case. Or they haven't been in the house before, which is likely the case. In which case, they should not be able to move around the house as comfortably, as easily as they did. As I said, this movie is better than I remember it being, though I still find it really irritating. And as I mentioned at the top, Renny Harlin is a great director. Not everything he does is good. So check out Devil's Pass. It's currently on Tubi, about that Russian expedition that goes into the mountains during winter and they essentially kill themselves. The story for that movie is just so far-fetched, but it's interesting. It's done in a found footage style, and it's worth seeing. I really like a lot of the things Renny Harlin does, Deep Blue Sea. So I think he is a perfect director to revisit The Strangers. So what do you think? This is Bryan with ScreenFiles.com interview. Do you agree, disagree? Let me know down below. And as usual, consider a like or a follow.